The Talos Starbelt was a sprawling, chaotic graveyard of pulverized rock and ancient ice, suspended forever in the absolute zero of deep space. It was a desolate region where starlight went to die, swallowed whole by the shifting shadows of colossal, slow-moving asteroids. Through this silent, grinding labyrinth slipped a Vare pirate cruiser, a vessel designed to look as sleek and predatory as a silver needle. Its stealth drives hummed at a frequency far too low for standard navigational sensors to register, making it a perfectly silent predator stalking the frigid, unforgiving dark. On the command bridge, bathed in the sickly, pale ultraviolet glow of the tactical displays, Captain Sarth Colleen observed his prey with unblinking focus. The target was a human freight ship, registered under the designation Morrow Saint. To Colleen's refined, multifaceted eyes, the human vessel was a masterclass in primitive, utilitarian ugliness. It hung on the monitor like a bruised, rectangular block of pitted iron and scarred titanium. Its hull was unnecessarily long, burdened by tiered rows of massive cargo containers that were stacked with all the grace of a collapsed monument. The sublight engines burned with a sluggish, dirty luminescence, bleeding wasted thermal energy into the void. There were no escort fighters hovering in its wake to offer protection. There were no exposed defensive turrets protruding from its heavily armored spine. A deep structural scan revealed absolutely zero signatures of heavy, military-grade weaponry anywhere on the vessel. To Captain Colleen, this was not merely a target of opportunity, it was a textbook victim. It was the absolute epitome of a civilian transport, meaning it was overweight, vastly undercrewed, and governed by a psychology of inherent weakness. Humans, in Colleen's extensive century of experience, built these massive hauling ships to move their endless, greedy commodities across the stars. But they built them with the foolish assumption of permanent safety. When that fragile safety was shattered, they invariably panicked. The tactical approach was almost insultingly simple: sever the main thrusters, force open the exterior airlocks, and let the sheer, paralyzing terror of a boarding action do the rest of the work. The Vare species prided themselves on an elegant, clinical detachment from the messy, visceral realities of physical combat. Their warfare was entirely a matter of extreme distance, advanced mathematics, and overwhelming thermal superiority. They utilized hyper-accelerated plasma needles that could thread through a command viewing port from a distance of 1,000 kilometers. Autonomous homing drones that hunted biological signatures with digital malice, and shield-piercing rifles that turned dense armor to scattered vapor. They maintained this absolute, unwavering reliance on ranged combat, largely because of their own biology. Colleen shifted in his command harness, his long, multi-jointed limbs folding with a sharp, mantis-like precision. His species possessed a delicate, almost crystalline skeletal structure beneath their segmented armor. They were incredibly fast, their reflexes were unmatched, and they were terrifyingly perceptive. But they were fundamentally brittle. The very concept of close-quarters physical combat was considered an archaic horror to them, a barbaric and suicidal practice beneath civilized beings, primarily because their bodies simply could not withstand direct kinetic impact. A solid, unmitigated blow from a dense, heavy object would shatter a Vare's limbs like frozen glass. Colleen tapped a slender, four-digited hand against the glowing console, bringing up the localized biological scan of the Morrow Saint. The display pulsed with a faint, heat-map topography of the human ship's dense interior. Deep within the heavily shielded habitation core, a tight cluster of thermal blips huddled together in the darkness. 32 life signs, Colleen murmured, his mechanical translator collar turning his natural clicking consonants into smooth, synthesized speech. All clustered tightly around the central mess hall and the primary crew quarters. Exactly as predicted. The readout cemented his supreme confidence. 32 fragile, terrified humans, shrinking away from the cold exterior bulkheads, gathering in the pathetic illusion of safety to wait for a negotiation that would never actually come. They were already defeated in their minds, coiling into a defensive posture that meant they had surrendered the ship before the first shot was even fired. "Target their primary engine manifolds," Colleen ordered, his voice echoing sharply in the chill, sterile air of the bridge. "Fire the electromagnetic dampening pulse. I want them completely dead in the water. Then, immediately launch 4 boarding pods. Aim for the structural valleys between the upper cargo tiers, the areas where their outer plating is the thinnest. Breach the hull and secure the internal corridors." Outside, in the vacuum of the asteroid belt, the Vare cruiser flared with sudden, violent energy. An invisible, devastating wave of electromagnetic disruption surged across the void, slamming directly into the rear engine block of the Morrow Saint. The human ship's dirty exhaust trails sputtered, choked, and died abruptly, leaving the massive, heavy freighter drifting, entirely powerless against the momentum of the void. Instantly, 4 metallic seeds spat from the belly of the Vare cruiser, leaving bright trails of ionized gas as they rocketed toward the silent, drifting behemoth. Inside the Morrow Saint, the terrible silence was broken not by an explosion, but by a bone-deep, sickening shudder. Captain Naomi Voss stood alone on the secondary command deck, feeling the heavy, metallic vibration travel up through the thick, steel grating of the floorboards and directly into the soles of her heavy work boots. It was a profound, deadening thud that spoke of sudden, catastrophic engine failure, followed immediately by the suffocating, descending whine of the primary power grid cycling down to its barest emergency reserves. An instant later, the bright overhead corridor lights snapped off. They were instantly replaced by a washing tide of harsh, crimson emergency strobes that painted the narrow, claustrophobic hallways in alternating flashes of blood red and pitch black. Internal klaxons began to wail, emitting a rhythmic, mechanical screaming that usually signaled the onset of total, unrecoverable chaos aboard a civilian vessel. But Naomi Voss did not panic. She did not clutch at the nearest safety railing, nor did she shout frantic, desperate questions into the open communication system. She was an American, born to the orbital shipyards, a woman whose face was permanently etched with the quiet, hard-earned stoicism of someone who had spent a lifetime treating catastrophic mechanical failures as mere logistical puzzles to be solved. Her eyes, cool and ruthlessly analytical, were already fixed on the central holographic schematic of the ship that rested on the master plotting table. She stood perfectly still, letting the angry red light wash over her features, waiting patiently for the internal pressure sensors to confirm what her finely tuned instincts already knew to be true. "Bridge to all sector heads," Naomi said, her voice dropping into the ship-wide communication network with the calm, impossibly steady cadence of a ticking metronome. "Report your status." The responses came back almost instantly, crisp and entirely devoid of hysteria. Engineering was dark but structurally holding. Cargo bays, 1 through 7, confirmed maximum structural integrity. Life support was rapidly dropping to auxiliary power, but the air pressure was still thick, warm, and breathable. Naomi watched the holographic schematic intently as 4 distinct, high-heat anomalies suddenly registered on the outer hull of the ship. The boarding pods. The Vare pirates had taken the bait perfectly. They had aimed directly for the thin plating between the cargo stacks, entirely ignorant of what actually lay beneath those specific, deliberately weakened sections of the ship. "We have 4 confirmed breaches," Naomi stated into the open comms, her tone almost conversational, as if she were merely noting a minor shift in the weather outside. "Outer hull integrity is now compromised in sections Beta, Delta, Epsilon, and Gamma. They are cutting their way inside right now." She reached out with a steady, unshakable hand and placed her palm over a manual, heavy-duty override panel that was completely unmarked. It was a heavy brass fixture that simply did not exist on any public blueprint or standard civilian freighter schematic anywhere in the known galaxy. "All hands," Naomi commanded, her voice suddenly dropping its conversational tone, turning hard, cold, and utterly uncompromising. "Initiate Protocol Forge Glass." Across the massive, groaning length of the Morrow Saint, the ship began to violently change. It was not a standard, chaotic emergency lockdown. The heavy, pressurized vacuum doors did not simply slam shut to seal off the breached sections to save oxygen, which was the standard, desperate response of a civilian crew merely trying to buy a few minutes of extra life. Instead, the ship responded with a calculated, asymmetric malice. Heavy steel doors hissed shut in seemingly random, unconnected locations. Thick bulkheads descended halfway from the ceiling and locked into place with a deafening metallic clang. Pressurized vents opened wide in some corridors to vent heat, while completely sealing off others to trap cold air. The doors closed only in places that made absolutely no logical sense to any outside observer. They closed in specific, jagged patterns that only the family of the Morrow Saint understood, turning long, straight thoroughfares into jagged dead-end traps, and wide cargo loading zones into claustrophobic, shadow-drenched choke points, where sight lines were reduced to mere inches. The Morrow Saint was no longer a simple transport ship. With the turn of a key and the violent hiss of heavy hydraulics, it had stripped away its harmless disguise. The red emergency lights flickered relentlessly, casting long, monstrous shadows across the heavily reinforced steel walls, revealing a terrible, hidden truth that the Vare boarding parties were about to discover firsthand. This old, ugly ship had not been built merely to carry raw materials across the stars. It had been meticulously, brutally, and patiently designed for a very specific, very intimate type of war. Naomi Voss possessed the quiet, unassuming stillness of a woman who had spent the first 2 decades of her adult life dismantling orbital defense stations from the inside out. Before she ever took the helm of a deep space commercial hauler, she had commanded an elite assault engineering unit during the brutal Jovian blockades. In those terrifying zero-gravity skirmishes, victory was never decided by grand tactical speeches or sweeping naval maneuvers painted on digital boards. It was won in the bloody, airless dark with heavy thermal breaching torches, magnetic locking boots, and a cold willingness to look a hostile combatant in the eyes before driving a pneumatic heavy bolt through their atmospheric visor. She had the permanently grease-stained, calloused hands of a master mechanic and the utterly pragmatic soul of a demolition expert. For Naomi, a catastrophic shipwide crisis was never a time for panic or despair. It was simply a complex mechanical failure that required an immediate, intensely physical solution. The pirates out in the void assumed the Morrow Saint was an inefficient, poorly designed bulk freighter dragging its mass across the stars. They were entirely wrong about the foundational reasons why. The massive vessel was a highly specialized transport, custom-built from the keel up to haul industrial gravity ceramic cores. These incredibly dense, volatile materials were the absolute foundation for space-time stabilization reactors, and transporting them required a containment vessel of absurd structural integrity. Because of this singular purpose, the Morrow Saint possessed a reinforced skeletal framework thick enough to withstand a direct meteor impact at high velocity, wrapped around an interior that viciously defied all standard ergonomic logic. The main corridors were a claustrophobic, logistical nightmare for anyone who did not live and breathe aboard the ship. The architecture featured punishingly sharp 90-degree turns, specifically designed to baffle accidental radiation leaks. Sections where the heavy steel-plated ceiling inexplicably dropped 2 full feet to accommodate overhead hydraulic lines, and narrow vertical technical ladders that completely replaced standard gradual stairwells. The main deck floor plating was wildly uneven, split-level by design, accommodating the massive, bulging bulk of the primary ceramic silos beneath the grates. There were no grand promenades or wide avenues for easy transit. There were only countless, jagged intersections and cramped crawl spaces barely wide enough for two grown adults to squeeze past one another, shoulder to shoulder. Hidden behind seemingly unmarked, flush utilitarian wall panels lay a vast, chaotic network of heavily shielded maintenance tunnels, deep in the sweltering, oil-slicked belly of the engineering decks. Deputy Chief Engineer Bram Foss stood perfectly still, pressing his massive, severely scarred palm flat against the vibrating primary bulkhead. Bram was a true giant of a man, a former deep space heavy welder who had spent 15 exhausting years patching cracked mining rigs out in the chaotic, high-risk asteroid fields. He was a man who rarely spoke a word aloud, communicating instead through low grunts and the undeniable, gravitational force of his physical presence. Right now, he closed his eyes and simply listened to the shifting metal of the ship. To Bram, the grinding shudder of the severed engine block and the distant, violent metallic thuds of the boarding pods breaching the outer hull were not just random noises of destruction. They were a pulse. He read the micro-vibrations traveling through the cold, titanium support beams, the way a seasoned cardiologist listens to a human heartbeat, mapping the exact locations, the weight, and the heavy, clumsy footsteps of the intruders pressing into their home. 3 decks above him, Cargo Chief Iris Keene was already in rapid motion. In the heavy, shadowed gravity of the primary staging hold, she navigated the impossibly tight, labyrinthine gaps between the towering cargo containers with a fluid, terrifying grace. Before signing onto the rusted decks of the Morrow Saint, Iris had been a competitive zero-gravity gymnast, possessing spatial awareness and twitch muscle physical reflexes that bordered on the completely absurd. She did not merely walk through the cluttered ship. She flowed over it, utilizing overhead handholds, exposed cooling pipes, and narrow structural gaps with absolute kinetic efficiency. Her current focus, however, was not the incoming boarding parties, but a very specific, heavily isolated section of the shipping manifest. She was the sole guardian of a highly specialized, unregistered payload that the sophisticated VAIR scanners had completely failed to detect. A silent, heavy secret, waiting patiently in the dark. In the stark, metallic confines of the central medical bay, Ship Dr. Calder Wren was methodically and ruthlessly dumping his standard trauma kits onto a cold, steel surgical table. He entirely bypassed the advanced laser burn salves, the sterile field generators, and the long-range radiation neutralizers. Instead, his quick, steady hands sorted through heavy-duty anesthetic auto-injectors, rapid expanding combat pressure bandages, thick suturing wire, and short-range, high-voltage muscular defibrillators. Calder understood the brutal, uncompromising mathematics of what was about to happen better than anyone else aboard. He knew that when highly advanced warfare collapses from a sterile distance of thousands of kilometers down to the intimate, terrifying span of a single human breath, the medical officer immediately ceases to be the safe rear guard. In a cramped corridor fight, flesh tears against jagged metal, bones shatter against unyielding bulkheads, and the medic becomes the absolute bleeding edge of the front line. Up on the darkened command deck, Naomi stood at the primary operations console, her fingers flying across the heavy manual input keys. She systematically initiated a deliberate, cascading failure across the ship's centralized digital control network. She intentionally darkened 80% of the main lighting grid, plunging the convoluted corridors into a heavy, oppressive gloom, illuminated only by the angry red emergency strobes. She permanently severed the remote access links to the heavy blast doors, the localized environmental controls, and the internal security camera feeds. She was actively forcing the entire massive vessel into a state of primitive, localized mechanical operation. If the highly advanced VAIR boarding parties expected to plug a sophisticated decryption cipher into a wall terminal and hack the ship's internal defenses, they would find absolutely nothing but dead electrical wires and solid, heavy iron manual levers. She keyed the localized intercom, broadcasting a secure channel only to the heavy earpieces worn by her crew. She did not ask them to hold the line for the sake of honor. She did not demand a desperate, suicidal final stand against a technologically superior foe. She delivered a single, unwavering directive that settled over the listening crew like a heavy, comforting iron blanket. "Do not play their game," Naomi commanded, her voice a low, gravelly rasp cutting through the static. "Pull them into ours." Out in the silent void, the pirate captain was still staring intently at his glowing biological scanners, supremely confident that he held the fragile fate of exactly 32 terrified souls in his long, multi-jointed hands. He was entirely unaware of the first, fatal trap that had already been successfully sprung. The 32 thermal signatures glowing brightly on his tactical screen were merely the surface crew. The deckhands and technicians deliberately left exposed in the habitation rings to paint a highly convincing picture of numerical vulnerability. What the incredibly advanced VAIR sensors could not pierce, and what their digital algorithms failed to account for, was the hyper-dense, radiation-absorbent shielding of the gravity ceramic cores scattered throughout the lower decks. Tucked away securely inside the empty, lead-lined containment silos, breathing slowly and gripping heavy, blunt-force industrial mining tools, were another 48 members of the Morrow Saints crew. They had vanished entirely from the digital realm, slipping off the pirate screens to become ghosts made of dense muscle and unforgiving steel, waiting patiently in the absolute dark for the fragile, long-limbed predators to step blindly into their iron maze. The breaching pod tore through the exterior hull of Sector Gamma with a blinding flash of superheated thermal energy. Molten slag rained down upon the interior deck plating, cooling instantly into jagged black scabs. As the pod's heavy ramp slammed down, Strike Leader Vale stepped into the Morrow Saint, his elongated plasma rifle raised and humming with lethal potential. According to the standard architectural blueprints downloaded from the Public Orbital Registry, this specific breach point should have opened into a vast, cavernous staging area spanning 300 yards in width. Instead, Vile and his elite boarding party found themselves staring down a suffocatingly narrow, winding canyon of solid steel. The human crew had deliberately rearranged the massive, interlocking cargo containers, magnetically locking them to the floor and ceiling to create an impenetrable, artificial maze right at the entry threshold. Vile's compound optical sensors clicked as they tried to adjust to the oppressive, strobing red emergency lights. A persistent, annoying static buzzed at the edges of his heads-up display. The digital layout of the surrounding corridors was updating with a sluggish, unnatural delay, lagging behind his actual physical movements by roughly 3 or 4 seconds. He did not know that the residual gravitational fields bleeding off the dense ceramic cores, buried deep within the ship's bowels, were subtly warping the local electromagnetic spectrum. Assuming it was merely a trivial glitch caused by their own electromagnetic dampening pulse, Vile ignored the latency. He raised a slender hand, signaling his squad to form up and advance into the gloom. However, the sheer architectural hostility of the artificial alley immediately shattered their standard tactical doctrine. The VAIR fought in wide, staggered formations, relying on overlapping fields of suppressive fire and constant lateral movement. But the space between the locked containers was so intensely restricted that the 8 members of the boarding party were forced to collapse their lines and march in a single, tight file. The environment began to fight them with every single step. The first corner they encountered jutted out at a brutal 90-degree angle, forcing the lead vanguard to awkwardly pull his long-barreled rifle back against his chest just to clear the turn without scraping the delicate muzzle against the rusted iron. The second corner did not merely turn. It sloped sharply upward over a makeshift ramp of welded grating, completely throwing off the delicate, towering center of gravity of the VAIR soldiers. Their segmented, multi-jointed legs, designed for elegant, sweeping strides across open and level battlefields, found absolutely no purchase on the uneven, heavily grooved industrial floor. The third corner was the worst of all. It forced the squad under a sudden, massive overhead hydraulic strut that had been manually lowered, dropping the ceiling height by nearly 4 feet. The tall, proud Ver warriors were forced to hunch forward painfully. Their sleek, composite armor scraped loudly against the cold iron above them, and their long weapons were rendered almost completely immobile in the crushed vertical space. They could not aim, they could not turn, and they were entirely stripped of the mobility that made their species so deadly. As the entire squad finally cleared the low overhang, dragging their boots over the raised floor plates, they stepped into a section of the corridor where even the emergency red strobes had been completely severed. They were swallowed by absolute, suffocating darkness. Vial immediately keyed his thermal and low-light optical enhancements, expecting the corridor to bloom into a clear, green, tinted digital wireframe. Simultaneously, the heavy industrial ventilation shafts directly above them snapped open. They did not drop toxic gas or explosive charges. Instead, they purged a massive, concentrated cloud of ultra-fine, hyper-reflective metallic dust. To a human, wearing a basic internal filtration mask, it was merely an annoying, gritty fog that tasted faintly of copper. But to the highly sensitive, light-amplifying optics of the Ver combat helmets, it was a sudden, catastrophic sensory overload. The microscopic iron filings caught the ambient lasers and the passive light-gathering sensors of their visors, scattering the photons in a billion different directions at once. The Ver optics flared with a blinding, agonizing white glare, effectively stripping them of their sight in a fraction of a second. Vial stumbled back, his long fingers clawing at the side of his helmet to initiate a manual reset. Blinded and utterly disoriented, the squad froze in the narrow choke point, their long rifles pointing aimlessly into the swirling, glittering fog. Then, a sound cut through the heavy, dust-choked air. It was not the high-pitched whine of a charging plasma coil, nor was it the heavy, thudding mechanical clatter of an automated sentry turret deploying from a hidden alcove. It was a sharp, distinct, and highly rhythmic metallic clank. It sounded exactly like someone casually tapping a heavy iron wrench against a hollow steel pipe. Twice. The signal was entirely analog, utterly untraceable by any digital sweeping gear, and it heralded absolute disaster. The first strike against them was completely silent and carried zero thermal signature. A heavy, localized magnetic field generator, stripped from a cargo loading crane and bolted directly to the ceiling structure, was suddenly powered to maximum capacity. It unleashed a localized, invisible net of pure magnetic force directly across the width of the narrow alley. The high-density alloy plating of the Ver combat armor was instantly caught in the invisible, crushing grip. 3 of the alien pirates were violently ripped from their feet and slammed sideways against the corrugated steel wall of a shipping container with bone-shattering force. They remained pinned there, helpless and thrashing against the sheer magnetic pressure, their long, delicate limbs rendered entirely useless as the magnetism locked their joints in place. Before the remaining 5 pirates could even register the sudden loss of their comrades or blindly fire their weapons into the blinding dust, the very walls of the corridor seemed to burst open. The humans did not charge from the front. They erupted from concealed floor grates, hidden side maintenance panels, and narrow gaps between the containers that were completely invisible on the corrupted tactical maps. They did not carry standard military assault rifles, nor did they issue grand, sweeping battle cries to announce their presence. They wielded the brutal, heavy tools of their blue-collar trade. One human lunged from a lowered ventilation shaft, driving the blunt, heavy nose of a pneumatic rivet gun directly into the fragile, exposed knee joint of a Ver soldier. The compressed air discharged with a deafening crack, instantly shattering the crystalline bone structure beneath the armor. The alien collapsed, completely incapable of supporting its own massive height. Another human, wielding a thick, heat-scarred polycarbonate welding shield, stepped directly inside the guard of the next pirate. The human, used the heavy shield, not just for defense against a panicked plasma discharge, but as a blunt force battering ram, smashing it upward into the Vare's elongated jaw, snapping the creature's head back with a sickening crunch. A third attacker swung a high-voltage industrial stun baton, a tool designed to jumpstart massive cargo haulers, directly into the unarmored neck seal of the squad's communications officer. The massive electrical discharge shorted out the alien's nervous system instantly, dropping him to the steel grating in a lifeless, violently twitching heap. The Vare boarding party had been thoroughly conditioned by decades of piracy to expect a very specific, predictable rhythm to civilian engagements. They expected frantic, tearful pleas for mercy crackling over the open communication frequencies. They expected chaotic, uncoordinated flight as the crew scrambled for the escape pods. They expected the soft, fleshy targets to cower behind locked doors, passively waiting to be flushed out by thermal breaching charges. Instead, they were met with an ocean of absolute, terrifying silence. The human crew of the Morrow Saint did not utter a single word as they systematically dismantled the elite strike force. There was no screaming, no hesitation, and absolutely no mercy. It was a clinically precise application of extreme physical violence, executed at a range so devastatingly close that the Vare did not even have the necessary milliseconds required to comprehend their own fear. They were a proud species that waged pristine, mathematical war from the absolute safety of the distant horizon, and they were currently being butchered in the dark by common laborers who destroyed them with the exact same ruthless, mechanical efficiency they used to dismantle a broken engine block. Near the forward prow of the vessel, the second boarding torpedo violently penetrated the exterior hull with a deafening shriek of tearing metal. The alien tactical sweeps had identified this specific ingress point as an unguarded technical artery, a path of least resistance completely bypassing the heavily shielded main crew habitation zones. In reality, it was the primary load balancing corridor, a highly specialized architectural feature designed to manage extreme, unpredictable shifts in the ship's overall mass. The decking here was not welded fast to the structural ribs. It was composed of massive, independent industrial plates resting atop colossal hydraulic pistons. This allowed the ship to dynamically alter the floor elevation at a moment's notice to distribute the crushing weight of asymmetrical cargo loads during turbulent, atmospheric descents. As the second squad of alien raiders stepped out of their breached pod and formed their elongated, sweeping tactical line, they found themselves standing on a flat, metallic expanse that felt deceptively secure. They raised their rifles, their compound eyes scanning the shadows for targets. Below them, locked securely in a reinforced subdeck, Bram Foss did not hesitate. His massive, calloused hand gripped the primary release lever for the hydrostatic pressure valves, and he pulled it down with a vicious, bodily heave. The locking mechanisms disengaged instantly. The entire 50-foot stretch of the corridor floor violently shifted. It did not simply tilt, it buckled unevenly, dropping 3 feet on the port side and thrusting upward by 2 feet on the starboard, instantly transforming the smooth, reliable thoroughfare into a jagged, broken staircase. The sudden, catastrophic loss of a level plane was devastating to the invaders. Their biology relied heavily on a high center of gravity and long, slender legs designed for elegant, sweeping strides across open battlefields. Instantly deprived of their balance, the raiders stumbled wildly, their multi-jointed knees buckling as they desperately fought the shifting artificial gravity just to remain upright. Simultaneously, a series of heavy, partial blast shields deployed from the ceiling above. They did not close all the way to the floor. They slammed down and locked into place exactly 5.5 feet above the tilted grating. The vertical space was instantly and aggressively compressed. The towering invaders were forced to crouch awkwardly, their spines bent painfully, and their long weapons suddenly catching on the descending metal plates. Meanwhile, the shorter, stouter humans could easily maintain a perfect, highly mobile combat stance beneath the iron canopy. Captain Naomi Voss did not wait for the enemy to regain their footing. She led the counter-assault team herself, exploding from a concealed side alcove with terrifying, silent speed. She carried no firearm to clear the path. Firing a projectile or energy weapon in this confined, volatile space was a chaotic gamble she refused to take. Instead, she charged directly into the fatal blind spot located squarely beneath the long, glowing barrel of the lead invader's energy rifle. The alien vanguard saw her blur into its peripheral vision and frantically tried to depress the muzzle of its weapon to track her. It fired a single, blinding lance of superheated plasma. Naomi raised a heavy, heat-resistant welding shield, leaning her entire body weight behind the thick polycarbonate curve. The plasma splashed against the shield, boiling the outer layer instantly and sending sparks showering into the cramped corridor. But the kinetic force did not slow her relentless momentum. Closing the critical distance in a fraction of a second, she dropped her center of gravity, rotated her shoulder, and slammed her entire body mass into the alien's chest. She struck slightly off-center to maximize the rotational force. The sheer, brutal impact hurled the creature backward. Its fragile, crystalline chest armor cracked violently against the unforgiving iron bulkhead behind it, the sound echoing like a massive sheet of thick ice fracturing under heavy, sudden pressure. Above the chaos, Iris Keene hung perfectly still from an open maintenance hatch, her boots locked magnetically to the upper rim, as another towering raider tried to twist its awkward frame and bring its weapon to bear on the captain. Iris dropped a heavy-duty magnetic cargo tether directly downward. The thick, braided steel cable snaked through the air, and she triggered the localized magnetic locking clamp exactly as it passed the alien's torso. The powerful magnets slammed shut, viciously wrapping the heavy cable around 3 of the creature's double-jointed arms. By using the alien's own elongated, complex anatomy against it, Iris transformed its flailing limbs into a panicked, self-tightening knot, completely neutralizing its ability to fight or even stand straight on the tilted floor. To her right, Calder Wren moved with terrifying medical precision. He completely ignored the traditional doctrine of staying safely behind the front lines to treat the wounded after the gunfire ceased. He understood intimately that in a space this intensely compressed, where survival was measured in inches and heartbeats, he was the absolute front line. An alien warrior, easily 2 feet taller than the doctor, managed to free a secondary sidearm and swung it toward Naomi's exposed flank while she was pinning the vanguard. Calder stepped directly inside the creature's guard, parrying the weapon arm with a heavy steel brace strapped firmly to his forearm. With his free hand, he drove a heavy, high-pressure industrial syringe directly into the exposed, flexible joint gap between the alien's neck and shoulder armor plates. He depressed the plunger fiercely, injecting a massive, instantaneous dose of heavy surgical anesthetic designed to knock out 2-ton livestock. The giant alien shuddered once, its weapon clattering to the slanted deck, before collapsing heavily into a completely lifeless, unconscious heap. The immediate skirmish ended as quickly and violently as it had begun, leaving the load-balancing corridor littered with incapacitated raiders. The air was thick with the harsh smell of ozone, burnt polycarbonate, and the sharp chemical tang of the anesthetic. Naomi stood over the shattered form of the vanguard she had driven into the wall, her chest heaving, the ruined, smoking welding shield still gripped tightly in her hand. As she kicked the alien's long rifle away into the shadows, a small, sleek, metallic device slipped from a ruptured armored pouch on the creature's waist and skittered across the slanted floor grating. Naomi knelt, her eyes narrowing as she picked it up. It was not a standard communication relay, nor was it a ship layout map meant to guide a boarding party. It was a highly sophisticated, military-grade decryption sequencer. She wiped a thick smear of soot from its hardened screen. The device was actively searching the ship's internal network for a very specific, localized digital beacon. The text blinking rapidly on the small display was not a cargo manifest number or a generic hull designation. It read, In perfectly translated standard syntax target acquisition, null mass container. A cold, heavy knot formed instantly in Naomi's stomach, freezing the adrenaline pumping through her veins. A container designated null mass absolutely did not exist anywhere on their heavily audited public shipping manifests. It was a ghost cargo, an impossibility on a civilian freighter. The sudden, chilling realization washed over her, changing the entire nature of the blood on her hands. This incredibly precise, violent boarding action was not a random act of piracy, born from an opportunistic encounter in the asteroid belt. The invaders were not here to steal raw minerals, extort credits, or salvage ship parts. They were acting on highly classified, insider intelligence. Someone had deliberately tipped off the pirates, providing them with the exact location and nature of a deeply hidden, unsanctioned secret buried safely within the armored hold of her ship. With two of the alien strike teams effectively neutralized and pinned within the labyrinth of the lower decks, the immediate, suffocating pressure of the boarding action fractured into a tense, heavily armed standoff. Captain Naomi Voss stood over the incapacitated Ver Vanguard, the acrid smoke of the recent skirmish still clinging to her fireproof jacket. She pressed two fingers to her earpiece, cutting through the localized static of the communications network. She ordered her strike teams to hold their ground and cease lethal force for the moment. They needed a prisoner. The sleek decryption device she had recovered was a stark warning that brute survival was no longer their only objective. They dragged the unconscious alien into a reinforced welding bay, strapping its long, fragile limbs to a heavy hydraulic workbench with thick, industrial zip ties. When the surgical anesthetic began to wear off, Calder Wren administered a sharp, chemical stimulant directly into the creature's primary respiratory vein. The Ver jolted awake, its multifaceted eyes spinning wildly before locking onto Naomi. She did not bother with threats. She simply held up the captured decryption sequencer, its screen still pulsing with the target acquisition order. Naomi clamped an emergency translation module onto the alien's armored collar. The device hummed, syncing with the creature's frantic clicking consonants and converting them into flat, synthesized English. She demanded to know what a null mass container was and why a pirate cruiser was risking complete destruction to claim it. The captive warrior, stripped of its elegant detachment and terrified by the raw, physical brutality of the humans, did not hold out for long. It confessed that their objective was never the ship itself or the valuable ceramic cores. They were hired exclusively to extract a single, highly classified shipping crate. The translation module sputtered as it translated the alien's description of the payload. It was not a weapon of mass destruction, nor was it a hoard of untraceable credits. The alien called it a quantum coffin. It was a heavily shielded, hyperdense stasis pod designed to house an anomaly capable of actively bending and warping localized gravitational fields. A deep, chilling dread settled heavily over the welding bay. Naomi exchanged a hard, knowing look with Calder. The terrifying reality of their situation snapped into sharp focus. Not a single soul on her active crew roster, except perhaps the upper echelon of the Colonial Alliance who had chartered this run, had any idea such a catastrophic device was resting in their cargo hold. It had been loaded at the orbital departure port under a blind, top-tier priority mandate, physically welded shut and completely masked from their own internal sensors. They were unknowingly carrying a cosmic anomaly, and now the darkest, most well-funded corners of the galaxy had come to collect it. Down in the primary staging hold, Iris Keene moved silently through the dense forest of shipping crates. Following Naomi's relayed coordinates, she located the specific section where the blind cargo was supposedly stored. She found the crate tucked away in a dead zone of the hold, completely surrounded by the dense, radiation-absorbing ceramic cores. The heavy, colonial-stamped physical seals were completely untouched. Nobody had breached the box. However, Iris ran a localized thermal sweep using her handheld diagnostic scanner. The results made the blood freeze in her veins. The object inside the quantum coffin was not inert. The internal temperature was fluctuating in a highly precise, cyclical rhythm. It was a rhythmic pulse of extreme cold, followed by a surge of heat, repeating exactly every 10 seconds. It was not acting like a dormant piece of technology. It was behaving exactly like a biological entity that was slowly, methodically waking up from a very long sleep. Before Iris could relay this terrifying development to the bridge, a completely different alarm tripped on Naomi's tactical display. It was a microscopic blip, an unauthorized internal transmission burst that lasted for exactly 0.4 seconds. It originated from the decommissioned, heavily rusted dispatch sector near the aft thrusters. The timing was entirely too precise to be a coincidence. Someone deep inside the Morrow Saint had broadcast a tight beam location beacon to the pirate cruiser mere moments before the boarding pods breached their hull. The crisis had fundamentally mutated. They were no longer just fighting off a pack of scavengers. They were trapped in the middle of a massive, heavily orchestrated conspiracy, and the architect of their doom was broadcasting from inside their own walls. Naomi was immediately forced to divide her already thinly stretched resources. She ordered half of her blue-collar militia to maintain the lockdown, hunting down the 2 remaining alien strike teams still lost in the claustrophobic steel maze. She tasked the other half, led by the hulking figure of Bram Foss, to tear the old dispatch sector apart and find the traitor. Bram did not rely on the ship's corrupted digital network to track the signal. He trusted his heavy hands and his intimate knowledge of the vessel's hidden veins. He descended into the dark, sweltering sublevels beneath the aft thruster block, dragging his heavy flashlight over miles of exposed wiring and rusted pipes. He found the source of the beacon hidden behind a heavy, welded grate. It was not a sophisticated digital tap. The traitor had bypassed the main computer entirely, physically splicing a raw, high-frequency emitter directly into an archaic, analog mechanical wire line that had been officially out of service for over a decade. Bram stared at the crude, but incredibly effective splice. The sheer technical brilliance required to execute such a bypass without triggering a ship-wide systemic failure was staggering. Whoever built this trap possessed an intimate, almost obsessive understanding of the Morrow Saint's deepest structural secrets. This was not a panicked, last-minute betrayal by a greedy deckhand. This had been meticulously prepared long before they ever left the orbital docks. He pulled the physical data log from the emitter's crude casing and plugged it into his heavy-duty diagnostic tablet. The decryption sequence ran for less than a minute before it spat out the registered identification code of the person who had last accessed that specific analog junction. Bram let out a low, gravelly breath as he read the name glowing on the cracked screen. The traitor was not one of the 32 terrified crew members currently fighting for their lives in the dark corridors. The digital signature belonged to a senior maintenance officer who had officially died in a catastrophic plasma fire exactly 6 months ago. His body had been cremated, his file had been securely archived by the colonial authorities, and his access codes had been permanently purged. Yet, his digital footprint was still crawling through the ship's forgotten arteries, like a technical ghost, manipulating the internal systems and guiding the alien predators right to their doorstep. The air inside the rusted corridor suddenly felt infinitely heavier. The isolated skirmish in the asteroid belt had officially escalated into a high-stakes war for absolute control over a scientific secret that possessed the raw power to fundamentally rewrite the balance of military power across the entire galaxy. The Morrow Saint was no longer just a freight ship. It was the epicenter of a conspiracy that reached beyond the grave. And the thing locked in the cargo hold was still slowly, relentlessly opening its eyes. The third Vare boarding party, monitoring the sudden and brutal silence of their vanguard teams over the tactical network, immediately abandoned the doctrine of a direct physical assault, realizing the labyrinthine lower decks of the human freighter were an intricately designed death trap. The alien commander opted for a completely remote approach. From the safety of a pressurized airlock, they unsealed highly advanced microdrones. Hundreds of them, the size of metallic gnats, flooded the primary ventilation shafts. These machines sought out thermal blooms, carbon dioxide exhalations, and micro-vibrations, compiling a flawless three-dimensional map of the ship's hidden architecture. The alien strike leader watched the telemetry flood his visor, believing that his squad had finally decoded the human structural puzzle and stripped away their only advantage. Deep in the command center, Naomi Voss monitored the subtle pressure shifts within the primary ventilation network. She recognized the creeping digital infiltration almost instantly. Instead of attempting to physically block the vents, she authorized a manual override of the primary coolant system. She ordered superheated steam, pressurized to completely unsafe and highly volatile levels, to be purged directly into the targeted shafts. The sudden, violent thermal expansion instantly boiled the delicate optical sensors of the alien drones. But more importantly, it projected massive, false biological heat signatures across the enemy's tactical net. Lured by these phantom targets, the third strike team advanced blindly into Sector Epsilon. Among the crew, this specific area was notoriously referred to as the acoustic zone. Here, the heavily ribbed hull plating and a series of misaligned acoustic dampeners created a dizzying, mind-bending auditory mirage. A footstep echoing sharply from the left actually originated from a heavy bulkhead 30 yards to the right. A dropped wrench sounded exactly like a collapsing ceiling directly overhead. The Vare warriors, whose optical sensors were still struggling with the residual steam and who relied heavily on highly sensitive directional hearing to track prey, were instantly paralyzed. The environment itself was lying to their senses, creating a suffocating psychological maze where every shadow carried the phantom echo of a charging enemy. Suspended directly above the disoriented aliens, Iris Keene navigated a primary exhaust conduit that was scarcely wider than her own shoulders. Flanking her were Milo Thane and Rhea Sorn, two young deckhands who spent 12 hours a day elbow-deep in grease, repairing these exact confined arteries. To the towering Vare, the ship was a crushing, incomprehensible trap. To Milo and Rhea, crawling through the dark, sweltering pipes was as natural as breathing. They moved with absolute silence, communicating only through soft, rhythmic taps against the iron framing. As the alien squad hesitated in the acoustic zone below, their long, multi-jointed arms awkwardly catching on the low-hanging handrails and exposed piping, the humans struck from the ceiling. They kicked the heavy maintenance grates outward, dropping into the narrow space like stones. They did not wield military-grade energy weapons. They unleashed heavy industrial nail guns, tools designed to anchor titanium plating to the hull. The high-velocity, diamond-tipped construction spikes pierced the alien composite armor with brutal, terrifying efficiency. Iris utilized a heavy, magnetic cargo hook attached to a braided steel line, sweeping the delicate legs of a towering raider and sending it crashing violently into its squad mates within the cramped corridor. The Vare reflex advantage was completely nullified at this proximity. They simply did not have the physical room to swing their long rifles or leverage their natural speed. Their elongated limbs became lethal liabilities, tangling with one another as the humans moved relentlessly through the chaos, fighting with the intimate, practiced efficiency of workers dismantling a broken machine. Panicking amidst the slaughter, one of the trapped Vare warriors reached for a high-yield pulse grenade, intending to vaporize the entire corridor segment, regardless of the cost to his own team. The explosive armed with a high-pitched, terrifying whine. Bram Foss emerged from a lateral access tunnel just as the alien raised the device. The massive engineer did not attempt to run or seek cover. Instead, he grabbed the manual release wheel of a solid lead radiation door that divided the corridor segment. With a guttural, strained roar, he heaved the heavy iron wheel, slamming the immensely thick door shut just inches from the alien's face. He threw the heavy locking latches just as the pulse grenade detonated. The reinforced bulkhead shuddered violently, bowing outward slightly from the sheer kinetic force, and the metal instantly turned scorching hot to the touch. But the lethal concussive wave was entirely contained within the sealed segment, turning the desperate alien into localized ash while leaving the humans completely unharmed. In the breathless aftermath of the ambush, Calder Wren knelt beside one of the fallen invaders to secure their remaining tactical gear and medical supplies. As he pulled away, the superficial, ragged pirate colors draped over the alien's chest plate, the doctor noticed a faint, chemically etched insignia on the inner lining of the armor. It was a stylized, predatory bird gripping a fractured planet in its talons. Calder's breath caught in his throat, a cold sweat breaking across his neck. That emblem did not belong to any disorganized syndicate of asteroid scavengers or Outer Rim pirates. It was the official corporate seal of House Sarek. They were a ruthless, multi-trillion credit paramilitary conglomerate, widely notorious for acquiring galactic anomalies, unregistered exotic technologies, and black market bioweapons. The entire pirate assault was a brilliantly executed, highly expensive false flag operation. House Sarek had deployed these disguised mercenaries to ensure absolute political deniability. If the Morrow Saint vanished in the deep dark of the Talos Belt, colonial authorities would chalk it up to tragic, everyday pirate activity, leaving absolutely no official paper trail leading back to the corporate boardroom that had actually ordered the slaughter. The crew was not fighting for their cargo. They were fighting against an entity that could buy and sell star systems. Suddenly, the ambient lighting in the corridor flickered, pulling Calder from his terrifying revelation. It was not the random, chaotic sparking of a damaged or overloaded power grid. The red emergency strobes dimmed to a dull glow, then flared brightly, repeating the cycle in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. Naomi, standing over the secured sector, felt a low, vibrating hum transmit through the thick soles of her boots. The vibration perfectly matched the exact timing of the pulsing lights. A profound, chilling realization settled over the captain. The null mass container secured down in the cargo hold was no longer merely waking up from its dormant state. It was actively interfacing. The object was broadcasting a low-frequency data stream directly into the primitive electrical nervous system of the human freighter. The lights were flashing because the entity inside the quantum coffin was synchronizing its own bizarre, rhythmic life cycle with the ship's mechanical pulse. It was slowly turning the Morrow Saint into an extension of its own nervous system. Naomi stared down the long, pulsing corridor, understanding that the timeline for their survival had just drastically compressed. If that heavily shielded object achieved full synchronization and broke its physical seals before they eliminated the Sarek mercenaries, the freighter would cease to be a simple battleground between two warring factions. It would become the birthplace of a terrifying third threat, a cosmic anomaly that neither the bruised human crew nor the highly advanced alien strike teams were remotely equipped to survive. Standing in the dim, red-strobing glow of the secondary command deck, Captain Naomi Voss bypassed the final 3 layers of colonial encryption. She did not use standard sensor sweeps. She routed the ship's primary navigational astrometrics directly inward, focusing a deep penetrating array entirely on the null mass container secured in the belly of her vessel. The holographic table flickered wildly, vomiting a cascade of error codes before finally rendering a stable, 3-dimensional image of the anomaly hidden inside the quantum coffin. It was not a biological entity, nor was it a conventional weapon of mass destruction. The heavily shielded box held a gravitational memory core. It was a perfectly smooth, impossible geometric structure of unknown alien origin, pulsing with a terrible, silent energy. According to the raw telemetry cascading down Naomi's screen, the core did not merely generate artificial gravity, it actively recorded it. It possessed a horrifying, surreal ability to absorb the kinetic energy and movement patterns of every single physical object within its localized radius, process that temporal data, and then violently regurgitate it by actively bending local inertia. Naomi stared at the shifting mathematical models with a growing sense of absolute dread. If this device were fully awakened and properly calibrated, it could spontaneously alter the directional pull of gravity within a confined space every single second. It would turn a standard, flat corridor into a three-dimensional nightmare, where the ceiling suddenly became the floor. Walls exerted crushing downward pressure, and forward momentum was instantly reversed without any physical warning. In a localized field like that, fighting from a distance became a physical impossibility. A hyper-accelerated plasma needle or a solid kinetic slug, fired from 50 yards away, would be caught in the warping localized gravity, instantly curving back to strike the shooter or spiraling harmlessly into the nearest reinforced bulkhead. House Sarek, the multi-trillion credit paramilitary conglomerate pulling the strings of this entire slaughter, did not want to study the core for the betterment of galactic civilization. They intended to weaponize it. They wanted to sell the ultimate localized area denial technology to the highest bidder on the sprawling galactic black market. But the individual who had initially smuggled the core aboard the Morrow Saint had clearly intended to keep it far out of the conglomerate's blood-stained hands. Until this exact moment, the true identity of that rogue sender had remained a complete mystery. Naomi dug furiously into the archived, heavily redacted port logs, tracing the physical supply chain backward through dozens of fake shell corporations and forged colonial mandates. She pushed past the superficial shipping data, diving into the raw code of the authorization matrix. She finally unearthed the original digitized signature that had authorized the blind cargo transfer. The name, flashing on her cracked display, sent a fresh wave of ice down her spine. Adrian Vale. Adrian Vale was a brilliant, highly decorated former research officer for the Colonial Alliance. He was also completely, officially dead. He had perished in a catastrophic orbital station collapse exactly 6 months prior. His physical remains allegedly vaporized in a localized fusion reactor breach. His death had been broadcast across 5 different colonized star systems. Yet, this was the exact same digital signature that Bram Foss had discovered tied to the analog distress beacon down by the aft thrusters. The technical ghost haunting her ship, the phantom actively manipulating the internal security doors and guiding the pirate boarding parties, was a dead man, and he was the one who had brought the apocalypse directly to their doorstep. As Naomi isolated his digital signature, a deeply buried, multi-layered data packet suddenly triggered on her console. It had been lying completely dormant in the ship's mainframe, waiting patiently for her specific command clearance to unlock. A raw, audio-visual log filled the main screen. Adrian Vale's face, gaunt, exhausted, and bathed in the harsh white light of a sterile laboratory, appeared amidst a backdrop of flickering static. He confirmed what Naomi had already begun to suspect. He was very much alive. He had orchestrated his own gruesome death to slip entirely off the corporate radar, stealing the memory core from a classified black site laboratory just hours before House Sarek could fully comprehend its reality-bending potential. He had selected the Morrow Saint specifically for its unique, heavy-duty construction and its fiercely independent crew, utilizing forgotten colonial supply routes to smuggle the artifact toward a neutral sector. He knew the corporation would eventually pick up his trail, which was why he had left a desperate emergency protocol embedded deep within the message. His voice, strained and echoing with deep paranoia, delivered a chilling operational warning. If the ship was ever boarded by hostile forces, the crew had to engage them at point-blank range. They had to utilize heavy, blunt instruments, industrial tools, and low-velocity physical impacts. The gravitational memory core was highly unstable and intensely reactive. It responded violently to high-yield energy discharges and long-range kinetic impacts piercing the hull. If a pirate or a defending crew member fired a heavy plasma cannon or a shield-piercing railgun anywhere near the cargo hold, the core would absorb that massive energetic spike and instantly invert the gravitational pull of the entire vessel, crushing the heavy freighter and everyone inside it into a sphere the size of a small marble. A grim irony washed over Naomi. The crew's brutal close-quarter style was not just instinct born from cramped industrial life. It was the only form of combat that could keep the Morrow Saint from imploding. By fighting with wrenches, shields, and magnetic tethers instead of high-energy weapons, they had unknowingly kept the core below critical mass. But the fragile, bloody victory they had secured in the lower decks was about to be entirely eclipsed. Just as the recorded message faded to black, the primary long-range astrometric sensors screamed in absolute panic. The internal klaxons, previously silenced during the stealthy hunt in the acoustic zone, resurrected their deafening, mechanical wail. Naomi violently swiped her hand across the holographic table, expanding the sensor net far beyond the immediate vicinity of the paralyzed Vare pirate cruiser. Deep within the pitch-black void of the Talos Belt, hiding perfectly within the massive sensor shadow of a drifting, frozen asteroid, a gargantuan new thermal signature flared to life. It was not another sleek, fragile pirate vessel, looking to scavenge the remains. It was a massive, heavily armored corporate dreadnought. Its stealth baffles were slowly disengaging, peeling back to reveal a colossal hull, bristling with heavy orbital bombardment cannons and massive, city-leveling electronic warfare arrays. It dwarfed the Morrow Saint entirely, casting a long, terrifying shadow across the sensor board. House Sarek had never intended to let the alien mercenaries actually finish the job or claim the bounty. The Vare pirates were merely expendable hunting dogs, sent ahead to corner the prey, test the internal defenses, and bleed the crew dry. The corporate dreadnought was here to physically secure the quantum coffin and subsequently vaporize the entire sector, ensuring absolutely no witnesses remained to whisper about the gravitational memory core or the conglomerate's direct involvement in its theft. The stakes of the conflict immediately ascended to a terrifying new echelon. The brutal, intimate skirmishes fought in the darkened, narrow corridors of the freighter were no longer the main event. They were merely a violent, bloody prelude. The true battle, a desperate, impossible fight for total survival against an overwhelming galaxy-spanning corporate military force, was just about to begin. The massive shadow of the House Sarek dreadnought slowly blotted out the distant, dying starlight, its primary weapon batteries glowing with a sickening, vibrant purple hue as they began to charge for a localized, total purge. The Vare cruiser, drifting in the icy, unforgiving void, suddenly found itself outclassed and entirely expendable. Aboard his dimly lit, ultraviolet-washed bridge, Captain Sarth Colleen watched the gargantuan House Sarek warship slowly decloak from the sensor shadows. The corporate dreadnought did not hail the pirate vessel. It did not transmit a standard docking sequence or a formal request for a tactical status update. Instead, its massive primary weapon batteries began to glow with blinding, localized radiation, targeting the exact spatial coordinates of both the fragile pirate vessel and the battered human freighter. Colleen, a survivor of 100 brutal campaigns, understood the cold, bloodless corporate mathematics instantly. His elite boarding parties were merely a disposable, temporary key used to unlock a highly stubborn, rusted door. House Sarek fully intended to erase the lock, the key, and the entire surrounding room to keep their illicit secret buried in the dark. For the first time since the catastrophic ambush began, Colleen opened a direct, unencrypted communication channel to the human command deck. His highly synthesized voice entirely lacked its previous arrogant, predatory drawl. He reached out not to issue a blood-curdling threat, but to propose a temporary, desperately fragile ceasefire. He explained with chilling clarity that if the corporate warship unleashed its heavy ordnance, every single living organism within a radius of 1,000 miles would be instantly reduced to free-floating atomic vapor. The pirates and the prey were now trapped in the exact same executioner's block. Captain Naomi Voss listened to the alien pirate's plea with a cold, hard, analytical calculation. She did not trust a single, frantic syllable echoing through her bridge comms. But her own deep space orbital sensors painted a terrifyingly clear and undeniable picture. The Sarek dreadnought was actively charging a massive battery of long-range, armor-piercing kinetic cannons. She had exactly 4 minutes before the first devastating volley shattered her ship into a million frozen pieces. Naomi was forced to dictate her terms with absolute, unyielding authority. The Vare hunters currently stalking the shadows of her lower decks had to stand down immediately. Any captured alien combatant would remain alive and relatively unharmed in a makeshift brig. In direct exchange for this mercy, Colleen had to instantly transmit the highly classified corporate identification codes and the precise, shifting shield frequencies of the approaching Sarek dreadnought. It was a devil's bargain struck at the edge of oblivion. Colleen swiftly broadcast the immediate stand-down order across his encrypted tactical network. However, the transmission was heavily garbled by the thick, radiation-absorbing ceramic shielding of the human ship, and a violent splinter faction of 4 surviving alien raiders flatly rejected the command. Driven by raw, unadulterated bloodlust and the tantalizing, magnetic proximity of the high-value bounty they had been promised, these rogues permanently severed their communication links. They made a frantic, suicidal dash toward the deepest, most heavily fortified cargo hold. This sudden fracture created a chaotic, deeply terrifying 2-tiered nightmare for the exhausted human crew. They had to stringently honor the macro-level ceasefire, with the heavily armed alien cruiser floating just outside their hull, while simultaneously engaging in brutal, close-quarter slaughter to permanently stop the rogue element ripping through their interior. Down in the sweltering, oil-slicked belly of the ship, Deputy Chief Engineer Bram Foss was already violently reshaping the battlefield. He marshaled his exhausted, bruised engineering team, utilizing heavy-duty magnetic tow cables and massive industrial cargo loaders to drag dozens of immense gravity ceramic containers into a dense, interlocking defensive ring entirely surrounding the null mass staging area. They did not simply build a static wall. They constructed a suffocating, jagged, 3-dimensional labyrinth. The midship section was violently transformed into an impenetrable fortress of crushed, groaning steel and terrifying blind corners. It became a space so intensely, physically tight, that a combatant could barely raise their own elbows to guard their face, let alone aim and fire a long-barreled energy rifle. It was within this suffocating, claustrophobic steel maze that Cargo Chief Iris Keene violently intercepted the rogue alien vanguard. She found herself standing face to face with a highly lethal female Vare warrior named Taj Ren. Unlike her fallen, easily disoriented comrades who had perished horribly because they could not adapt to the cramped, punishing environment, Taj had completely discarded her long, cumbersome plasma rifle. She wielded twin, short-bladed, superheated thermal knives and moved with a terrifying, incredibly compact fluidity that genuinely rivaled Iris's own highly trained zero-gravity reflexes. Their ensuing duel was absolutely not a simple contest of brute, kinetic strength or overwhelming firepower. The ambient, artificial gravity within the narrow corridor was actively degrading, pulsing in a sickening, highly rhythmic distortion, leaking directly from the slowly waking quantum coffin, secured just a few yards away. The iron floor felt crushingly heavy for exactly 3 seconds, then suddenly became completely weightless for 2. Iris and Taj engaged in a lethal, breathtaking 3-dimensional dance of death. Victory in this impossibly tight space belonged entirely to whoever could perfectly anticipate the erratic, mind-bending gravitational shifts. When the localized gravity suddenly spiked, violently dragging them both downward, Taj lunged forward with her burning blades. Iris did not waste precious energy resisting the crushing pull. She threw her entire body weight backward, utilizing the heavy gravity to slide rapidly beneath the alien's flashing, lethal strikes, before launching a devastating, bone-shattering upward kick with her heavy magnetic boots. Exactly at the microsecond, the gravity released its crushing hold. While Iris fought desperately for her life in the shifting, disorienting dark, Ship Doctor Calder Wren feverishly monitored the localized, wildly fluctuating telemetry of the alien artifact. He rushed into the makeshift command center, his face utterly pale and dripping with cold sweat. He had just discovered another terrifying, completely unexpected nuance to the alien machine. The gravitational memory core was not merely blindly warping local physics. It was actively, hungrily learning. It was rapidly absorbing the immense kinetic data of the human crew's relentless, desperate close-quarters combat. The longer the humans fought, bled, and moved with brutal efficiency within its immediate, localized radius, the more the core actively synchronized its bizarre temporal rhythm with human biomechanics rather than the alien physiology of the invaders. It was becoming fundamentally, dangerously attuned to the violent rhythm of the human heartbeat. This terrifying, paradigm-shifting revelation sparked a wildly reckless, completely suicidal strategy in Naomi's razor-sharp mind. There was absolutely no mathematical way the scarred, slow-moving, heavily burdened freighter could ever outrun a state-of-the-art corporate dreadnought, nor could its rusted hull ever survive a direct, centered hit from a massive armor-piercing kinetic shell. Instead of desperately trying to hide or shield the highly volatile artifact, she decided to completely weaponize the very thing that currently threatened to annihilate them all. She would intentionally, manually trigger a partial, highly controlled activation of the memory core at the exact, precise microsecond the Sarek warship fired its first devastating volley. By projecting the core's violently deflected, reality-bending inertial field outward through the hull, she aimed to physically bend and alter the trajectory of the massive kinetic shell in the absolute vacuum of space. It was a tactical plan of absolute, breathtaking insanity. It completely required her to maintain total, unwavering control of the chaotic internal battlefield, keeping the core absolutely safe from the rogue Ver intruders until the final, critical, heart-stopping moment. She had to hold the fragile, bleeding line in the dark, claustrophobic heart of her beloved ship while staring directly down the massive barrel of a corporate apocalypse, tying every single fragile thread of their collective survival to a fraction of a second, where unyielding human grit would violently collide with an awakened cosmic anomaly. The surviving defenders of the Morrow Saint gathered in the cramped, heavily shadowed atmospheric processing hub. They were a battered, exhausted collection of mechanics, cargo haulers, and navigation officers, their heavy work clothes stained with engine grease and the dark blood of the alien invaders. Captain Naomi Voss stood in the center of the weary circle. She stripped away the remaining layers of operational secrecy, speaking with a blunt, unvarnished honesty that offered absolutely no false comfort. She detailed the true nature of the gravitational anomaly sleeping in their lower hold and the terrifying reality of the corporate dreadnought currently powering its main batteries just beyond their hull. She laid out the bleak, uncompromising mathematics of their situation. If her desperate, theoretical plan to weaponize the core failed, every single soul aboard would be vaporized in a fraction of a second. She offered any crew member the immediate option to seal themselves inside a standard escape pod and take their slim chances in the freezing void. The silence that followed her offer was absolute. Not one single person broke eye contact. Not a single heavy boot stepped backward toward the evacuation bays. They simply gripped their heavy wrenches, industrial rivet guns, and magnetic tethers tighter, anchoring themselves to the deck of the only home they had left. Up on the bridge, the communication console chimed with an incoming, heavily encrypted data packet. Pirate Captain Sarth Colleen had transmitted the 16-digit corporate identification cipher exactly as their fragile treaty demanded. However, as his synthesized voice echoed over the open channel to confirm the transfer, Naomi detected a subtle, arrogant shift in his cadence. Colleen casually noted that his crippled vessel was initiating a slow, low power drift to distance itself from the impending corporate bombardment. Naomi's ruthlessly analytical mind caught the lie instantly. A crippled ship seeking genuine safety would burn every last ounce of auxiliary power to widen the gap. Colleen was not fleeing. He was quietly maneuvering his sleek cruiser into the massive physical blind spot created by the corporate dreadnought's sensor shadow. He fully intended to let the humans clear the treacherous path. Waiting for the exact second, the Sarek warship focused its heavy cannons to launch a final, lightning-fast boarding action and steal the artifact right out from under the chaos. Naomi immediately isolated a secure, localized frequency to reach Iris Keen and Bram Foss. She ordered her two most lethal close-quarters specialists to completely abandon the outer perimeter of the cargo bay. They were to fall back directly to the heavily reinforced chamber housing the quantum coffin. She did not instruct them to build a solid barricade to keep the remaining rogue pirates out. Instead, she ordered them to construct a highly specialized, purely mechanical snare just inside the primary doorway. Utilizing high-tension steel hauling cables, industrial compression netting, and proximity-triggered magnetic locking clamps, they wove an invisible spiderweb in the dark. The objective was entirely non-lethal, but infinitely more cruel. They were setting a trap designed to physically ensnare any interloper who breached the threshold, instantly wrapping them in a crushing, inescapable bind that allowed absolutely zero physical room to extend a limb, draw a weapon, or even shift their body weight. With the final defensive line quietly set, Naomi noticed a sudden, rhythmic flickering on a rusted maintenance panel directly beside the main corridor bulkhead. The dead man's digital ghost was actively reaching out again. She followed the sequential activation of low-voltage service bulbs, letting the Phantom guide her away from the primary cargo thoroughfares and down a forgotten, freezing access tunnel that bypassed the main hold entirely. The archaic, analog lights led her to a heavily shielded, auxiliary environmental regulator room, tucked behind a massive filtration manifold. Inside the freezing, cramped compartment, Naomi discovered a secondary, heavily frosted cryogenic suspension cylinder. Thick, armored data cables ran from the base of the cylinder, snaking through a hole cut in the floor deck, to physically hardwire directly into the side of the massive quantum coffin, secured in the room below. A cracked, wall-mounted diagnostic monitor flared to life as she approached, automatically playing a final, heavily degraded visual file. Adrian Vale's exhausted, hollowed face filled the tiny screen. The devastating truth finally crystallized in Naomi's mind, tying every chaotic thread together. How Sarek was not merely hunting a piece of stolen, reality-bending exotic technology. They were hunting its architect. The null mass container did not just house the gravitational anomaly, it housed its master. Adrian Vale had locked himself in deep biological stasis, deliberately tethering his own fading life signs to the alien artifact to forcibly stabilize its volatile quantum matrix during the long, perilous transit across the star system. He was the cargo, and he was the only living organism in the known galaxy who possessed the exact mathematical sequence required to permanently neutralize the core. Naomi stood before the heavily frosted glass of the cylinder, watching the agonizingly slow, shallow rise and fall of the frozen scientist's chest. She faced a brutal, terrifying binary decision. She could leave him in suspended animation, completely guaranteeing the alien artifact remained in its current, relatively stable slumber, but thereby forcing her exhausted crew to fight the impending corporate onslaught, entirely blind to the machine's true, catastrophic capabilities. Alternatively, she could initiate the rapid emergency thaw sequence, violently ripping him from his deep stasis and risking a massive, localized gravitational collapse before the Sarek dreadnought even fired its first shot. She stared at her own soot-stained, bloodied reflection in the thick glass. The entire philosophy of her crew, the very reason they had survived the alien slaughter in the dark, was rooted in their fundamental willingness to step directly into the ultimate danger zone. They won their battles because they deliberately discarded the safety of distance and fully embraced the intimate, terrifying risk of proximity. Naomi slammed her heavy fist into the manual emergency release lever. The cylinder hissed with sudden, violent pressure, purging thick clouds of freezing nitrogen gas into the cramped room. The viscous biological suspension gel drained rapidly through the floor grates, and the heavy glass door swung open with a heavy metallic groan. Adrian Vale collapsed forward, his emaciated body racked with violent, agonizing spasms as his dormant, frozen nervous system violently rebooted. Naomi stepped forward, catching him by the shoulders and bracing his dead weight against her armored chest. The scientist coughed up a lungful of synthetic amniotic fluid, his eyes wild, bloodshot, and entirely unfocused as he stared into the strobing red emergency lights. Naomi opened her mouth to deliver a rapid, condensed tactical situation report, to explain the pirates, the dreadnought, and the impending doom. But Adrian reached up with terrifying, desperate strength, his freezing fingers grabbing the thick collar of her fireproof jacket. He did not ask where he was. He did not ask for a status update. Nor did he demand an explanation for the chaos echoing through the hull. He pulled himself agonizingly close to her face, his voice a raw, ragged rasp that cut straight through the wailing ship alarms. "Do not let them fire the first shot," he warned, his words trembling with absolute, primal terror. "If they do, the ship will remember how to die." The corporate warship slipped into optimal firing range, blotting out the stars like a descending iron curtain. Deep within its armored belly, the primary spinal cannon sparked, accelerating a hyperdense kinetic slug to a fraction of the speed of light. At that exact, terrifying moment, Adrian Vale's trembling, frostbitten fingers locked over Naomi's hand. Together, they slammed the manual activation lattice of the gravitational memory core into a partial, highly volatile wake state. The entire freighter did not merely shake, it convulsed violently, groaning as if a massive, terrifying heart had suddenly begun to beat beneath the steel floorboards. The localized laws of physics fractured. The armor-piercing corporate shell, designed to effortlessly punch through 3 layers of reinforced titanium, hit the artificially warped inertial field surrounding the human ship. Instead of penetrating the hull, the sheer kinetic energy was caught in the gravitational distortion and violently bent outward. The slug curved in an impossible arc, merely scraping the outer plating of the Morrow Saint before tearing directly into the sleek, lurking silhouette of the alien pirate cruiser. Aboard his crippled, burning bridge, Sarth Colleen watched his port engines vaporize, the sudden, brutal realization crashing over him. He was never a partner. He was just an expendable pawn in a billionaire's execution game. Inside the freighter, the fragile treaty disintegrated instantly. The rogue faction of alien boarders, completely abandoning their crippled mothership, blasted through the secondary atmospheric seals and poured into the final staging area. Naomi, Iris, Bram, and Calder met them head-on in a space where reality was actively having a seizure. The core's partial activation plunged the narrow corridor into a state of total gravitational chaos. The directional pull shifted wildly with every single frantic heartbeat. 1 second, the ceiling became the floor, dragging everyone upward with bone-jarring force. The next second, a brutal lateral pull slammed the combatants horizontally against the jagged bulkheads. The invaders' sophisticated tactical formations dissolved into a frantic, flailing panic. Their long, precision-engineered rifles were utterly useless when they could not even determine which way was down. The fight instantly devolved into a primal, brutal clash where only hands, shoulders, absolute proximity, and nerves forged from solid iron mattered. Iris Keene found herself thrown upward into a tangle of overhead hydraulic pipes, locked in a lethal scramble with the female warrior Taj Ren. The alien was incredibly fast, her thermal blades slashing through the air, but she fought against the shifting gravity, desperately trying to maintain her standard upright posture. Iris, a creature born to the zero-gravity void, embraced the absolute chaos. When the artificial gravity violently inverted, pulling them both sideways toward a heavy steel doorframe, Iris did not brace for the impact. She intentionally surrendered to the fall. Twisting her body midair, she used her heavy magnetic cargo hook to grab Taj's armored harness. Using the alien's own momentum and the crushing lateral gravity, Iris swung the warrior directly into the unforgiving iron archway. Taj struck the metal from what had been above them just 1 second prior, the sickening crunch of armor and bone echoing through the corridor. A few yards away, Bram Foss became a living, breathing blast door. He wedged his massive frame into the only access breach, leading directly into the core chamber. With his left hand, he engaged a heavy magnetic cargo lock, and with his right, he physically held the searing hot, buckling steel plate against the frame. 3 desperate alien raiders unleashed their plasma cutters, trying to carve through the gap. Searing heat washed over Bram's exposed arms, blistering his skin and turning his heavy coveralls to ash. But the giant engineer simply gritted his teeth and pushed back with the unyielding strength of a mountain. He held the gap down to a mere 2 inches, absolutely refusing to let a single, hostile body slip past his guard. Then, Sarth Colleen arrived. The pirate captain, having abandoned his dying ship, breached the inner sanctum through a hidden maintenance vent, making a desperate, final play to steal the core before the corporate dreadnought could correct its aim. Naomi stepped directly into his path. Their final clash was the absolute distillation of the entire war. Colleen was terrifyingly fast, possessing long, multi-jointed arms and the desperate, surgical precision of a cornered predator. Naomi was grounded, heavy, utterly stubborn, and she possessed an intimate, instinctual understanding of every single inch of the cramped corridor. When the gravity spiked heavily downward, Colleen's long legs buckled slightly under the unexpected weight. Naomi charged. She did not swing wildly. She used a scarred industrial heat shield like a battering ram, stepping inside his extended reach. Colleen tried to bring a sidearm to bear, but the space was simply too tight. Behind them, Adrian Vale used the absolute last drops of his conscious, unfrozen life. His voice was a bloody whisper as he bypassed the core's primary limiters, shouting for Naomi to push the artifact into its reactive memory configuration. Naomi reached backward, blindly smashing the secondary override sequence. The core screamed. It took the massive, accumulated kinetic energy of the brutal melee and projected it outward into the vacuum. The entire freighter became a colossal, unpredictable inertial spring. Outside, the Sarek dreadnought fired its second apocalyptic volley, but the human freighter suddenly snapped into a violent, impossible lateral spin, moving with a jagged, physics-defying jerk. The dreadnought's shell hit the expanded inertial field, and due to the core's reactive memory, the devastating kinetic force was flawlessly reflected along its exact vector of origin. The massive slug bounced off the invisible, warping barrier and struck the corporate warship's own primary weapon battery. The dreadnought's forward section erupted in a blinding, silent bloom of nuclear fire, its offensive capabilities instantly and permanently crippled. Inside, Naomi used the sudden inertial lurch of the ship to throw her entire body weight forward. She slammed the heavy industrial shield directly into Colleen's chest, crushing his fragile sternum and pinning him brutally to the deck. Without missing a single beat, she engaged the magnetic locks on her boots, securing them both to the floor, and slammed her bleeding hand onto the central communication terminal. She hit the broadcast key, transmitting the entire encrypted data packet over an open, unblockable civilian frequency. The raw attack logs, the undeniable House Sarek identification ciphers, and the digital contracts proving the corporate hiring of the pirate syndicate blasted across the galaxy, screaming toward the nearest independent relay station. The secret was out. The corporate executioners were exposed to the light. The aftermath was swift and coldly decisive. The crippled House Sarek warship, burning and utterly terrified of the incoming colonial fleet that would surely follow the broadcast, turned and limped into the dark. The remaining pirate forces completely fractured, fleeing into the asteroid belt like scattered dust. Adrian Vale managed to survive just long enough to see his impossible cargo transferred to a heavily armed, neutral colonial investigative agency. He passed away quietly in the medical bay, his body finally failing after the catastrophic damage inflicted by the prolonged, crude stasis. The Morrow Saint eventually restarted its repaired sublight engines and continued its long journey. From the outside, anyone looking at the sensors would only see a deeply scarred, incredibly ugly, and tremendously heavy freight ship dragging its mass across the stars. But buried deep within the highly classified records of the surviving crew, and whispered in the darkest corners of the galaxy, it became a legend. It was the rusted ship that had faced down both a ruthless pirate syndicate and an unstoppable corporate military machine, teaching them a brutal, ancient lesson that humanity had never forgotten. Never be foolish enough to step into their reach when the steel is narrow, the air is thin, and the breath is hot. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please leave a comment to let us know where in the world you are listening from, so we can interact and share our thoughts. I invite you to subscribe to the Sci-Fi Stories channel, like this video, and support us even more by hitting the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by many more people.